The professor stood confidently at the podium in the University of New Hampshire auditorium, his voice steady and assured. "It's time to move beyond myths," he declared. "For centuries, religion has held humanity back, and one of the most enduring stories shaping lives today? Jesus, let's be clear, Jesus is nothing more than a fairy tale." A hush settled over the room. Some students nodded in agreement, while others quietly took notes. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest, White House press secretary in history, was on campus as a guest speaker addressing Gen Z's role in politics. With her sharp Washington style and unwavering Catholic faith, she carried herself with confidence. But as she passed through the hallway, the professor's words reached her ears. She stopped in her tracks, her hand clenched instinctively. She was no stranger to controversy, having faced intense scrutiny in the White House. But dismissing Jesus, the foundation of her faith, as a mere fairy tale, that was something she couldn't ignore. Inside the auditorium, Professor Daniel Hargrove, a renowned progressive scholar, pressed on. He leaned over the podium, his gaze sweeping across the students. "Look at the facts," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "A man who walked on water, turned water into wine, rose from the dead. The story of Jesus is no different from Greek mythology or Viking legends. There is no reliable historical evidence proving he existed as the Bible claims. It's a tale woven to control the masses." Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, absorbing his words. A girl in the front row scribbled furiously in her notebook, while a guy in the corner scrolled through his phone. Hargrove smirked, reveling in the moment. "I know this may be difficult for some of you," he continued, "but it's time to grow up. Science and reason are the only paths forward. Religion, especially the Jesus myth, is just baggage from the past." He paused as if expecting applause. Instead, the door clicked open. All eyes turned toward the entrance as Karoline Leavitt stepped inside. Dressed in a sharp blue suit, her presence commanded attention. Her eyes burned with quiet intensity. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Isn't that the White House press secretary?" someone whispered. Hargrove's expression darkened slightly at the interruption. He tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. Karoline took a measured breath and stepped forward. The sound of her heels against the wooden floor was deliberate. Each step a silent declaration. She stopped in the aisle, meeting the professor's gaze. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm yet firm, carrying through the room. "I couldn't help but hear you say Jesus is a fairy tale. And I have to tell you, you're wrong." A charged silence filled the air. Hargrove arched an eyebrow, a smirk flickering across his lips. "Oh? And who might you be?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I didn't expect a politician to care about my history class. Are you here to defend this myth?" Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the podium, her arms crossed in quiet confidence, the stance of someone used to facing an aggressive press corps. "I'm not here to defend a myth," she said, her voice sharp as steel. "I'm here to defend the truth." The tension in the room thickened. "You claim there's no evidence for Jesus," she continued. "Then explain Tacitus, a non-Christian Roman historian who documented Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate, or Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who wrote about Jesus as a real figure with significant influence. These aren't biblical sources. They're independent historical records." Whispers spread through the auditorium. Students reached for their phones, fact-checking her words in real time. Hargrove's smirk lingered. Arms crossed, he shrugged. "Ah, Leavitt," he said coolly. "You may be a skilled spokesperson for Trump, but don't bring your political games into my lecture hall. Those so-called sources? If they even exist, they're nothing more than fragmented anecdotes written decades later. They prove nothing, except that good storytelling can endure." Karoline tilted her head, a spark of defiance flashing in her eyes. "A good story?" she repeated, her tone edged with sarcasm. "Then why did that story change the world? Why have billions lived and died for it? You can dismiss Jesus as a fairy tale all you want, but you can't deny his impact, historical or religious. Take your pick. To ignore him entirely? That's not science, that's arrogance. The room stirred. A single student clapped hesitantly, then stopped, uncertain. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He had expected an argument, but not one so swift, so sharp. His voice hardened. Who do you think you are, Miss Leavitt? A theologian, a historian, or just a mouthpiece for outdated ideas? Karoline's lips curved into a knowing smile, one devoid of warmth. I'm someone who believes in truth, she said, her voice unwavering. And the truth is, you've just insulted millions, including me, by calling Jesus fiction without a strong argument, Karoline said, her voice unwavering. If you want to debate, I'm ready. The University of New Hampshire auditorium had transformed into an arena. At the podium, Professor Daniel Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, his icy gaze locked on Karoline Leavitt. The students sat on the edge of their seats, eyes wide. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording every moment. Karoline, petite but commanding in her deep blue suit, remained unfazed. The tension in the room was palpable, like a fuse waiting to be lit. Hargrove finally broke the silence, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Miss Leavitt, do you really think you can just waltz in here and lecture me? He let out a scoff. You believe a few scraps from Tacitus or Josephus are enough to prove Jesus was real? How disappointing, especially from someone who claims to be informed. He shook his head as if scolding a naive child. Karoline's lips twitched. Her eyes flashed with defiance. Disappointing? She echoed, her tone edged with mockery. I don't need you to know who I am to tell you that you're wrong. She took a step forward. You think dismissing anything that doesn't fit into your neat little rationalist box makes you clever? No. I'm standing here for what I believe, for what my family, my Catholic faith, and history itself have taught me. She squared her shoulders, her voice as firm as iron. Jesus isn't just a name in a book, he was real. And you can't erase that just because you don't like it. The student stirred, whispers rippling through the crowd. Hargrove let out a dry laugh, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Oh, Catholic faith, he said mockingly. Is that the armor you're wearing here? I suppose working for Trump forces you to cling to fairy tales for justification. He smirked. But let's be honest, Miss Leavitt. Do you really believe he walked on water, turned water into wine, rose from the dead? Is that what you want these students to buy into? He gestured to the audience, inviting them to join in his ridicule. Karoline took a steady breath, keeping her composure even as her eyes burned with determination. I'm not here to force anyone to believe in miracles, she said, her voice unwavering. That's a personal choice, but calling Jesus pure fiction? That's flat out wrong. She glanced at the students, then back at Hargrove. You want sources? Tacitus recorded his execution under Pilate. Josephus mentioned him as a real historical figure leading a major movement. That's not legend, it's history. You don't have to believe he was the Son of God, but denying he existed? That's not intelligence. That's willful blindness. Hargrove crossed his arms, tilting his head as his smirk returned. History, he scoffed. You mean scattered anecdotes written decades later by people who never saw him? You call that evidence? I call it hearsay, overblown by a fanatical mob. He narrowed his eyes. You seem smart, Miss Leavitt, but it looks like you'd rather swallow what's shoveled at you than actually analyze it. Karoline straightened, her stance unshaken. Analyze? She said, her voice lowering, but crackling with intensity. That's exactly why I'm here. She took another step toward the podium. I don't just swallow anything. I grew up in a Catholic family in New Hampshire. I played softball to build grit. I learned to see truth through both reason and heart. She locked eyes with him. You can mock my faith all you want, but you can't erase Jesus's impact, not just on me, but on billions of people who have lived by his teachings. A male student in the middle row hesitantly raised his hand. Miss Leavitt, what do you mean by impact? Do you actually believe in the miracles? The room turned to her, waiting for her answer. Karoline gave a small, genuine smile, the first in the debate. "Great question," she said, her tone softening. "I believe in the power of Jesus' ideas: love, forgiveness, sacrifice. Whether you believe in the miracles or not is up to you. But don't let anyone tell you he didn't exist. He changed the way we live, the way we build societies. That's not a fairy tale, that's a fact." Hargrove let out a loud, exaggerated laugh, his frustration finally showing. "Ideas, huh?" he sneered. "You're just turning a fictional character into a convenient symbol to prop up your conservative politics. I know this game. You learned it from Trump, didn't you? Using emotion to override reason. But in this classroom, we deal in facts, not sappy feelings." Karoline tilted her head, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Facts?" she repeated, her voice rising with defiance. She took one last step forward, locking eyes with him. "The fact is," she said, "you just insulted millions, including me, by calling Jesus fiction without a real argument to back it up. And you say I'm the one using emotion?" She let the words hang in the air. "Fine. I'm human, not a robot. But don't get it twisted. My case rests on truth. On history, not feelings," Karoline shot back. "You dismiss everything that doesn't fit your worldview. Is that reason or just stubbornness?" The room erupted in murmurs. A girl in the front clapped, then hesitated as Hargrove's sharp gaze swept over the audience. Another student shouted. "She's got a point." Hargrove's fists clenched, his face reddening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by an outsider barging into his class. "You want to argue emotions?" he snapped. "Fine, but keep your politics and superstitions out of my classroom." Karoline stepped closer to the podium, her eyes locked on his. "I didn't bring politics here," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I brought truth, something you seem to have forgotten how to face, and if you want to keep going, I'm game." Whispers rippled through the students. Phones were held high, capturing every second. At the podium, Professor Daniel Hargrove stood, rigid, his anger barely concealed. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt, petite but formidable in her deep blue suit, met his glare without flinching. What had started as an academic discussion had spiraled into something more, a clash between cold skepticism and unwavering faith. Hargrove took a deep breath, struggling to maintain composure, but his voice still carried the tremor of frustration. "You call me stubborn, Miss Leavitt?" he growled, jabbing a finger toward her. "I've spent my life studying history, analyzing sources, dissecting facts. And you, a young woman who's nothing but a mouthpiece, dare to lecture me on truth?" His lip curled. "You think a few scattered mentions from Tacitus and Josephus are enough to make me bow to your Jesus? Ridiculous. You walk into my class full of confidence, but your politics and superstitions have blinded you." Karoline tilted her head, a faint smile crossing her lips, devoid of warmth. "Blinded?" she echoed, her voice laced with defiance. "No. I'm standing here because I see the truth, one you refuse to accept." She folded her arms, taking another step forward. "I don't need to be your student to recognize that dismissing anything outside your rationalist box is a mistake. I grew up in a Catholic family in New Hampshire. I was taught to question, to dig deep, because I don't settle for easy answers. And I'm not here for politics or superstition. I'm here for the truth that history has already proven." The students held their breath. Silence thickened the air. Hargrove let out a dry laugh, but it rang hollow. "Your truth," he sneered. "Your truth is a story spun by a fanatic mob, used by people like Trump to manipulate emotions. You say Jesus changed the world? Sure, I won't deny the myth's influence, but influence isn't proof of existence. Hitler influenced the world too. Does that make him a god?" A sharp gasp rippled through the audience. Karoline's eyes blazed as she took another step forward. "Don't compare Jesus to Hitler," she said, her voice like steel. "That's a cheap trick, and you know it. Jesus taught love and forgiveness. Hitler brought death and destruction." She exhaled, regaining her control, then met his stare head-on. "But if you want to talk about influence, Look at the laws we follow, the morals we uphold, the society we've built. Where do you think those values came from? From Jesus' teachings, a real person, not a fiction. You don't have to believe he was the Son of God, but don't pretend he didn't leave a mark deeper than anyone in history. Hargrove's arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes flashing. You really are Trump's disciple, he said coldly. All flashy words, no substance. You think cliches will sway these students? They're smarter than that. They want truth, not feelings. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming. Tell me, do you believe her or do you believe science? A female student in the middle row hesitantly raised her hand. But if there are historical documents mentioning Jesus, she asked, doesn't that prove he was real? A guy chimed in. Yeah, and Tacitus wasn't even Christian. Why would he make it up? More whispers spread, heads nodding. Hargrove spun back, his face even redder. Those documents aren't reliable, he snapped. They were written too late, possibly forged or just rumors. You want to believe rumors? That's not science. That's naivete. His finger stabbed the air toward Karoline. And you prey on that naivete. Just like you do at the White House, I expected someone barging in here to bring a better argument. Karoline's jaw tightened. She stepped onto the podium, leveling herself with him. Her voice was low but powerful, like a wave-gathering strength. Your personal story doesn't make you right, Hargrove growled. I don't care how you grew up. I care about evidence, real evidence, not the fragmented anecdotes you keep repeating. Karoline smiled this time, a victorious smile. Real evidence? She echoed. You want evidence? Look at history. Without Jesus, do you think we'd have hospitals, schools, or even the concept of human rights? Those didn't just appear, they came from his teachings. You can call them anecdotes, but I call them the foundation of our world. The students erupted in applause, no longer shy. She's right, a girl shouted. Another student raised his phone. I just looked it up. Tacitus is real. Hargrove's fists clenched, his lips pressing into a thin line. He wasn't used to losing control of the room, especially not to a stranger who had barged into his class. You're good, he said, his voice dropping, tinged with bitterness. Polished, but don't expect me to buy into this performance. You might fool them, but you won't fool me. Karoline met his stare, fearless. I don't need to fool anyone, she replied. The truth speaks for itself. I stand here for what I believe, and I won't be silent just because you refuse to listen. She stood on the podium in the University of New Hampshire auditorium, her presence small in stature but commanding in presence. Professor Daniel Hargrove, renowned scholar, self-proclaimed champion of reason, gripped the edge of the lectern, his gaze flickering between anger and something else. For the first time in the debate, he didn't respond immediately. The students leaned forward, phones recording. Some even stood to cheer. Hargrove could feel the shift. He was losing ground. Karoline took a slow breath, lowering her voice but making it resonate even more. If you see this as a loss, maybe the problem isn't me, she said. Maybe it's how you view truth. Her words struck like a blade, not cruel but sharp. A heavy silence settled over the room. Students whispered, some nodding in agreement, others watching Hargrove, waiting. Hargrove opened his mouth, but no words came. He turned away, eyes dropping to the worn wooden floor as if searching for answers in its time-scratched lines. He had no memory of Karoline Leavitt before today. She was just a stranger, an unexpected opponent. Yet something about her words lingered. Had he missed something? Had he been wrong to shut his mind to what couldn't be measured? For years he had studied history with cold, clinical reason. But now, her conviction made him pause. Karoline didn't let the silence stretch too long. She turned to the crowd, her voice warm but unwavering. I'm not here to force you to believe Jesus is the Son of God, she said, scanning their faces. That's your choice. But to dismiss him entirely? To call him a fairy tale? That's dishonest. Science doesn't explain everything about humanity. And history isn't just data, it's people, ideas, those who change the way we live. Jesus was one of them. He was real, and he matters. A male student in the back raised his hand, his voice curious. But if science can't prove miracles, why do you still believe? Karoline smiled, genuine this time. Good question, she said. I believe because I see the power in his teachings. Love, forgiveness, sacrifice. I grew up with them. I live them. Miracles? That's up to you to decide. But don't let anyone tell you Jesus didn't exist, just because we can't measure everything. Hargrove looked up. His gaze was no longer harsh, just thoughtful. Her words echoed in his mind, stirring something long buried. He remembered his early days as a scholar, when he read the Bible not to debunk it, but to understand it. When had he changed? When had he decided that reason was everything, that anything unmeasurable was an illusion? He looked at Karoline again, and for the first time, he didn't see a naive fool. He saw a woman who had found something bigger, something he might have lost. The student stirred, energized. A girl in the front stood up, her voice excited. I agree with her. If Jesus wasn't real, why did the whole world change because of him? A guy next to her added, but if it's just influence, why argue? Hitler had influence too. Karoline turned. To him, her eyes firm. Don't use that cheap comparison, she said. Hitler destroyed, Jesus built. His influence is the foundation of the best in us. That's the difference. Hargrove frowned, but didn't counter. Not right away. Instead, he stepped aside, resting a hand on his desk, as if needing support to think. Am I really being honest? He had spent a lifetime denying Jesus. But now, as he faced Karoline's unwavering arguments and the undeniable shift in the room, he wondered if he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Hargrove felt a crack in the wall of his own certainty. He looked at Karoline, his voice lowering, for the first time, free of sarcasm. You say science doesn't explain all of humanity, he said slowly. But if we don't rely on science, what do we rely on? Emotion? Faith? Is that what you want these students to learn? Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. I want them to learn to think for themselves, she said. Science is an incredible tool, and I respect it, but it's not everything. Faith, history, emotion, and those are part of being human too. I didn't need you to teach me to question, Professor. I already knew not every answer comes from a lab. Jesus doesn't need a test tube to prove he was real. He proved it through what he left behind. The students erupted in applause again. She's right, someone shouted. Hargrove stood motionless, his hand trembling slightly at his side. He scanned the young faces watching him, not with blind awe but with curiosity. Challenge. Had he been too rigid? Had he missed something? The students were restless now, some standing, phones raised, recording. The debate had peaked, the tension breaking into something electric, something alive. Karoline took a deep breath, then turned back to them, her voice ringing warm and strong. You're Gen Z, my generation, she said, sweeping her gaze over them. I'm not here to force you to believe anything. I just want you to think for yourselves. Jesus isn't a fairy tale. He's part of history, part of what shaped us. He was real, and he matters. You want to dismiss him? Fine. But do it with truth, not arrogance. And if you have more questions, I'm always game. Here or on X. She winked, adding just the right amount of humor. The students laughed, some clapping, loudly. Then Karoline did something unexpected. She stepped down from the podium, moving closer to the crowd. She raised a hand, quieting them, her voice lowering but magnetic. I don't need you to agree with me, she said. I just want you to question. Like I did. She glanced at Hargrove. Not with defiance, but with a quiet respect. For a moment, he was reminded of his early teaching days when he had urged students to challenge everything, not just accept his words. When had he changed? When had he stopped questioning? He looked at her again, and for the first time, he didn't see an adversary. He saw someone reminding him why he had once loved this job, The students didn't notice Hargrove's silence. They were too caught up with Karoline. A guy in the back yelled, "You should be a professor here." A girl raised her phone. "I'm posting this on X. Karoline wins." Laughter rippled through the room. Karoline shook her head, amused. "Thanks," she said, her tone light. "But I like my White House job better. Less paperwork. More laughter." The tension had lifted, but the respect in the room remained. Finally, Hargrove spoke. His voice was low, slow, no longer sharp. "Are you done, Miss Leavitt?" he asked, his gaze on her. There was no hostility in it this time, only curiosity. Karoline nodded. "I'm done," she said. Then, after a beat, "But I hope you're not. I hope you'll rethink what I said." Her words weren't an attack, but an invitation, a challenge not forceful but meaningful. Hargrove didn't answer right away. He turned to the students instead. His voice was quieter than usual. "Class ends here today," he said. Then, without another word, he stepped off the podium, grabbing his briefcase. The students whispered among themselves. "Did he just give up?" one murmured. But Hargrove hadn't given up. He just needed time. As he reached the door, he glanced back at Karoline. Just for a second. There was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, though he didn't voice it. Karoline stayed, surrounded by students asking questions. "How do you stay so calm?" a girl asked. Karoline laughed. "I'm not always calm." A guy cut in. "Do you think the professor will change his mind?" Karoline followed their gaze toward Hargrove, who was now near the exit. "I hope so," she said simply. "He's a smart man. I just want him to reconsider." Hargrove stepped into the hallway, gripping his briefcase tightly. Behind him, the students were still buzzing with energy, still cheering, still questioning. And Karoline was still answering them, still standing her ground. For the first time that day, a faint smile touched his lips. He wouldn't call it defeat. But he knew he'd been shaken. As he walked toward his office, he already knew what he'd do next. He would reopen old books, revisit Tacitus and Josephus, the historical accounts he had once dismissed. Not to agree with Karoline, but to understand, to question, like he had once taught his students to do. A few minutes later, Karoline stepped out of the auditorium. The students were still buzzing around her as she pushed open the door, stepping into the sunlight. Breathing in the crisp New Hampshire air, Karoline Leavitt felt a quiet relief, not from winning, but from standing her ground. She hadn't defended her beliefs just for herself, but for those like her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Notifications, flooding in from X and TikTok. Students were already sharing clips of the debate, their excitement spilling into the campus air. Clusters of students lingered outside the auditorium, voices rising in animated discussion. "She was incredible," one said. "The professor didn't stand a chance," another added. A TikTok video had already racked up hundreds of views in minutes. The hashtag Karoline wins was spreading fast. Karoline walked across the University of New Hampshire campus, sunlight filtering through the trees, catching the deep blue of her suit. The students' cheers still echoed behind her, but she wasn't basking in victory. This wasn't about beating Professor Hargrove. It was about standing for what she believed in. Her phone buzzed again. X and TikTok notifications flooded her. Green, and Karoline wins climbing the trending list. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Gen Z moves fast, but deep down she knew. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was something bigger. Meanwhile, in a quiet office at the edge of the faculty building, Professor Daniel Hargrove closed the door behind him, shutting out the lingering hum of student chatter. Silence settled over the room, thick and heavy. He set his briefcase on the desk, his hands unsteady as he pulled out his chair. His gaze drifted to the bookshelf. A familiar sight, filled with thick volumes of history and philosophy. Books he had studied for decades. His mind echoed with Karoline's words. Jesus doesn't need a test tube to prove he was real. He proved it through what he left behind. The words weren't a wound, but a needle, sharp enough to make him pause. With a sigh, Hargrove reached for a worn copy of Tacitus's writings, a book he had once dismissed as unreliable. He flipped through the pages, fingers tracing the Latin text. He had always believed these records were nothing more than myth. Yet myths didn't last this long. Myths didn't hold this kind of power. For the first time in years, doubt crept in. Not about science, but about his own certainty. Karoline hadn't convinced him, but she had made him question himself, and that was something no one had done in years. Beyond the faculty walls, the ripple effect of the debate was already spreading. A student's TikTok, titled "White House Press Secretary Takes Down Professor," was gaining thousands of views by the minute. On X, Karoline Wins was trending locally, igniting debates in the comments. Finally, a Gen Z conservative speaking up. One post read, "She's just a mouthpiece for superstition," another scoffed. Karoline wasn't surprised. Division was nothing, new not in politics and certainly not in faith. But this time it felt different. This wasn't just about politics. This was about a generation finding its voice. Karoline paused by a wooden bench on campus, sitting down as she scrolled through the flood of responses. One TikTok comment caught her eye. "I'm not religious, but she makes me want to learn more." She smiled and typed a quick reply. "Thanks. Keep asking questions. I'll answer." Then she opened her texts. "Karoline, today was wild, but I'm okay. How's the little one?" Her husband's reply came instantly. "Husband, boy sleeping soundly. You did great. Tell me everything later." Karoline stared at the message for a moment, warmth filling her chest. Someday, she thought, she would tell her son about days like this, about standing up for what's right. Back in his office, Hargrove sat motionless, the Tacitus book still open before him. The arrogance he had felt that morning was gone. Karoline's argument lingered in his mind. Do I really understand everything? Slowly he reached for a pen and scribbled a note on a scrap of paper. Tacitus. Josephus. Cultural impact. He wasn't sure where these notes would lead, but for the first time in years he wanted to explore, not to debunk, but to understand. Karoline had nearly reached the parking lot when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, her White House assistant. "Karoline, the debate video is going viral." The excitement in the assistant's voice was unmistakable. "Everyone here wants you on air tonight to talk about it." Karoline exhaled, gripping the phone a little tighter. "Fine," she said, "but I'll do it my way, no script." She ended the call, got into her car and stared ahead. This wasn't just another day. It was a milestone, a story she'd carry throughout her career. From his office window, Hargrove watched as Karoline's figure disappeared behind the trees. He gave a faint smile, not of defeat but of something else. For the first time in years he felt it again. Curiosity. Turning back to his desk, he reached for another book. This time, one on religion's influence on Western civilization. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was finally ready to read. Karoline Leavitt had left an impression on the students, but more than that, she had left a mark on him, deeper than he expected. Sitting in her car, she watched the sunset paint the road ahead in gold as she drove away from the University of New Hampshire campus. Her phone continued to buzz, notifications flooding in. The debate video had now surpassed tens of thousands of views. Karoline Wins was spreading rapidly across X and TikTok. But this wasn't just about defending Jesus. As a historical figure, she had ignited a larger conversation about faith, history, and the power of Gen Z to shape both. Meanwhile, in his dimly lit office, Professor Daniel Hargrove remained at his desk, the Tacitus book still open before him. His expression was distant, thoughtful. The debate had been more than an academic exercise, it had been a turning point. For Karoline, today had proven that Gen Z could stand up for the past without losing the future. She had shown that faith and reason weren't enemies, they were two forces lifting humanity forward. From the auditorium to social media, she had sparked something in a new generation, an urge to question, to explore, to stand firm in their beliefs. And Hargrove, the once arrogant scholar who had dismissed anything unmeasurable, now sat with a newfound curiosity. He hadn't changed instantly, but a seed of doubt had been planted. A realization had taken root. Truth wasn't always found in what he could control. Students had witnessed it all. Some left the debate searching for Tacitus and Josephus, digging into history for themselves. Others uploaded clips of the debate, eager to discuss it with friends. They hadn't just seen a verbal sparring match. They had watched a 27-year-old White House press secretary fuse history, conviction, and Gen Z energy to challenge a worldview. That was the biggest lesson of the day. Standing up for what you believe doesn't require a script. It doesn't require power, just truth and courage. Karoline gazed out of her car window, thinking of her young son. She wanted him to grow up knowing that history and faith weren't relics to be discarded. They were foundations to build on. Back in his office, Hargrove slowly closed his book, a faint smile crossing his lips. He reached for a pen and jotted down a simple note. Question, like she did. He had never known Karoline before today, but she had made him rethink, and he wasn't sure where that would lead him, but he was ready to find out. More than a debate, a reflection of America. The showdown between Karoline Leavitt and Professor Hargrove at the University of New Hampshire mirrors the deeper tensions and opportunities in today's America, where scientific reason and traditional values, older generations and a bold Gen Z often collide. In an era where debates over religion, history, and cultural identity dominate platforms like X and TikTok, Karoline's argument didn't just spark an academic discussion. It became a reflection of how Americans confront their differences. With her well-researched case for Jesus as a historical figure, backed by Tacitus and Josephus, Karoline represented young conservatives striving to preserve a faith heritage in an increasingly secular world. Hargrove, on the other hand, embodied a segment of American intellectuals who at times dismissed the past without full consideration. His initial arrogance and later self-reflection illustrated a lesson many overlook. True wisdom isn't about shutting down opposing views, it's about being willing to reconsider. The takeaway in today's America: don't slam the door on those who see the world differently. Listen, question, engage. Like Karoline did with the students. Like Hargrove, who, despite his resistance, ultimately began to rethink. When Karoline invited people to continue the discussion on TikTok, she demonstrated the power of openness and connection, something sorely needed in a divided culture. And when Hargrove reopened Tacitus after the debate, he proved that even the most confident minds should remain willing to explore beyond their assumptions. The lesson here is simple but urgent. Stand firm in what you believe, as Karoline did in defending faith and history, but do so with truth and courage, not just emotion. In an America marked by cultural clashes, from elections to religious freedom debates, this balance between conviction and openness is the key to turning conflict into understanding. So take inspiration from Karoline. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep standing for the truth. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring what shapes America today.